Greetings, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Cognitive Dominance, a Brain Surgeon's Quest to Outthink Fear, brought to you by Peak Performance Physicians and Princeton Brain, Spine, and Sports Medicine. My name is Dave Clark. I'll be your host today. Before we get started, just a few notes to start things off. This will be an interactive webinar today. We'll have a live audience Q&A session at the end of today's presentation, and you can type your questions at any time into the Q&A box that you'll find on your screen. We're interested today in all of your questions. Get them all in. Don't be shy. We'll spend as much time as we can today answering them. You can also use that Q&A box on your screen to communicate with me if you're having any technical problems during the webinar today. I think you'll be just fine, but if you have any problems at all, just let me know what the specific problem is, and I'll provide some help. And I think we're ready to get started with today's presentation. So let's meet today's presenter. It's Dr. Mark McLaughlin. Dr. McLaughlin is a practicing board-certified neurosurgeon, a national media commentator, author of the book Cognitive Dominance, a Brain Surgeon's Quest to Outthink Fear, and an acclaimed keynote speaker. He's the founder of Princeton Brain, Spine, and Sports Medicine, where he practices surgery, focusing on trigeminal neuralgia and cervical spine surgery. Dr. McLaughlin is also a thought leader in performance enhancement and physician-hospital relations. So as our presenter today, Dr. McLaughlin will be leading us through the rest of today's event. And with that, Doctor, I'll hand things over to you. Take it away.
Thank you, David. Jesus Rodriguez miscalculated. The moment his head struck the bottom of the pool, his body went numb. Floating to the surface and gasping for air, he called for his son, who called an ambulance and brought him to Bay State Medical Center on a warm July night in the year 2000. I met him in the emergency room in my first month of practice. He was quadriplegic. He had a C4-5 fracture dislocation, and I took him emergently to the operating room, placed him in the prone position, and after about 2.5 hours, reduced his spine, fused it, and took him back to the ICU. His chances for recovery were 1 in 1,000. Miraculously, he began wiggling his fingers and his toes a couple days later, and he walked out of the hospital 2 weeks later. And I remember that feeling. I remember that exhilaration of feeling, oh my gosh, this is exactly what I wanted to do, and I'm right here where I want to be. About a month later, a young boy came to the emergency room. He was an 8-year-old young man who had fallen off the school bus and cut his head. His parents were at the bedside, and what they said to me was, "Doc, there's something wrong with our child. We own a pizza parlor down the street, and he's my #1 helper. Anthony does everything for me. He busses my tables, but now he's dropping things. He's acting like he's drunk. He's sleeping a lot." A quick MRI scan showed that he had a tumor in the back of his brain pressing on his brainstem. And the next day, I took Anthony to the operating room with that same excitement and thrill, and I put him in the prone position, made an incision on the back of his head, turned a craniotomy flap and opened up the covering of his brain, and came down on a very angry looking tumor. 5 hours later, I shaved the last remnants off of his brainstem, and I took him to the ICU. He woke up perfectly, but then over the course of the next 24 hours, he began to have complications. I'm going to come back to Anthony. We've all lived with fear ever since we were young. There's an old story about a primitive caveman who goes into his cave and by the firelight draws a picture on the wall of a saber-toothed tiger. The picture's so real, he's terrified and he runs out of the cave. It sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But isn't that exactly what everybody does when we think about things that are possibly going to happen in our lives? Everybody, close your eyes for a moment right now. What are your fears? What stresses you out? Do you have a loved one with an addiction? Worried about losing a parent? Finances? Retirement? Hospital takeover? dying? Open your eyes now. Nobody lives without fear. It's universal. It knows no boundaries. It doesn't discriminate, and is deeply personal. It can retard our growth and prevent us from being the person we dream to be. And I'll posit to you that fear kills more dreams than failure ever will. The emotion is the same, whether you're on the deck for a wrestling mat like I was in college, or you're about to seal the biggest business deal of your life. Whether you're going into a difficult operation, or whether you're facing your own cancer scare. One thing's for sure, we can't banish fear. A certain amount of it makes us rise to the occasion. It's a key ingredient in the recipe for peak performance. And too much can paralyze us. Too little, we underperform. So since we all have to deal with it, we've got to figure out a way to deal with it constructively, to manage it if we want our best performance. So how do we deal with it? Well, my answer is something I've learned over my career. And in a nutshell, it's called cognitive dominance. It's a concept that I picked up while teaching a class at West Point on elite performance. When I first heard the term from a cadet, I was intrigued. Enhanced situational awareness that facilitates rapid and accurate decision-making under stressful conditions with limited decision-making time. I thought, wow, how do I get to be more cognitively dominant? And what inhibits me from being cognitively dominant? Well, after a lot of thought and research, I've realized that in order to function from a perspective of cognitive dominance, one needs to commit to 3 actions: lifelong learning, consilience, and the power of platform. Lifelong learning, not only because it's healthy for your brain, but it makes life more interesting. Consilience, which is a drawing from different principles and different disciplines. And thirdly, maximizing the power of your platform, reaching your maximum potential by constantly getting to the next level. So first, let's talk about lifelong learning. And I would add to that, adopting an attitude of lifelong curiosity. To write my book, I did a deep dive into performance enhancement literature. I reflected on my 28-year education and career, and I leveraged my background and experience in brain anatomy and the neurosciences to think about cognitive dominance and its relationship to fear in the way our brain functions. So the first article I came across was by then a little-known Malcolm Gladwell in 1999. He wrote an article in the New Yorker about the physical genius. And he looked at 3 virtuosos. The 2 on your right you can easily recognize, Wayne Gretzky and Yo-Yo Ma. The one on the left is a gentleman by the name of Charlie Wilson, one of the greatest neurosurgeons who ever lived. And what Gladwell was trying to focus on is, what are the factors associated with the physical genius? What are the commonalities of these virtuosos? How can they perfectly synchronize their movements on a sheet of ice, on a cello, or in someone's brain? And what he found was they had 3 commonalities. They had an efficiency of movement like none other. They had a capacity to pick up subtle patterns rapidly, something called chunking, like a professional baseball player hitting a pitch, making a split-second decision whether it's a high, low, or right in the strike zone. They store familiar sequences that can be recycled and acted upon. And lastly, an obsession with the possibility and consequences of failure. That fascinated me. Here are the greatest achievers in their field, and they're obsessed with the consequences of failure. You know, this story ultimately led to Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers, and the myth about the 10,000 hours. It was extrapolated from Gladwell's book that if you want to be an expert in something, you need 10,000 hours of training. And yes, 10,000 hours is important, but the original research was actually done by Anders Ericsson. And he didn't say it was just 10,000 hours. He said it was 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. It was focused practice. It was concentrated practice. And it certainly is not the only thing you need to do to become an expert, but it is one of the necessary things. Well, when looking at my career, which began in the Halloween of 1970 as a young boy, because I always wanted to be like my grandfather, the doctor, I looked at everything that I had done throughout my whole career. It takes 40,000 hours to become a neurosurgeon in my training years. 40,000 hours of residency and fellowship, and then another 20 years of practice translated to another 50,000 hours of practicing. I spent 9 years of my life on call, and I made approximately 140,000 patient encounters in that time. After 28 years of practicing, I've performed at least 30,000 critical decisions, life and death decisions, like when to operate and when not to operate, when to observe and when to intervene in a major way. I've spent 250 hours drilling on someone's skull and another 1,400 hours drilling on the spine. You see, the central dilemma for a neurosurgeon is doing the least harm in a whole series of escalating worst-case scenarios. This is a kerosene rongeur. Its job is to bite tiny pieces of bone away from compressed nerves. Over my 28 years, I've pulled this trigger on this gun 1,000,000 times. Every single time I close that mouth on that instrument, it's vitally important to the person I'm pulling it on. Some might casually say, oh, you probably get used to it. I don't. No good surgeon ever does. When you pull that trigger, when you're drilling on that bone, when you're making those decisions, they shape you into who you become. You know, our brain is an experience-dependent organ. And these repetitive motions and actions and decisions make you a thinking, concentrating performance machine. Now, you can't just be a machine. You got to talk to patients and families. And in neurosurgery, you experience the unfolding of some very sad life events. One of the most difficult and important jobs of being a neurosurgeon is delivering bad news to patients and families. It never gets easy. I estimate I've told over 2,000 families that their loved one is dead, has a malignant brain tumor, or is paralyzed. I've told another 1,000 that their loved one will survive, but will never be the same. You see, medicine does a great job in teaching physicians and nurses how to treat diseases, but we're not trained well in how to deal with the emotions that affect us, our minds. Well, it's become clear to me that two of the biggest occupational hazards of my profession, and in a larger sense in all of our lives, for yours too, is that the key distractors of human performance are fear and grief, especially in these times. I'm comforted by the Nietzsche quote, anyone can endure a what as long as they have a why. One of the ways I've been able to cope with my experience, my why, is why did I write a book? Well, I didn't want to write a memoir. There are plenty of great memoirs out there. Henry Marsh, Do No Harm, Atul Gawande has a number of great books. I wanted to do something different. I wanted to find out, what have I learned from all of this stress? So let's do an exercise. I want to induce some stress. We all know that public speaking is high on everybody's fear exercise list. So I've asked Dave now to pick randomly one of our participants, to put them live on the screen and ask them to talk about the human cerebellum for 1 minute. Just tell us everything you know about the cerebellum. You know, it's a coordination center, et cetera, et cetera. We'll just flip onto you and you can get started. Are you ready? Dave, are you ready? I'm just kidding. I just wanted to wake you all up, and I wanted to induce fear. I wanted you to feel that emotion that we all have, okay? Well, what is it? Let's define fear. I came up with two definitions. One was mine, and one was my co-writer, Sean Coyne's. My definition of it was the anticipation of not performing to my highest standards, of harming someone because I was not properly prepared. Sean, my co-writer, he defined it as the neurological response to an unexpected event that triggers a negative emotional response. See, my definition was internal, his was external. So we decided we needed to unpack this word even more. And what we did was we created a semantic differential scale, similar to what we use in the hospitals when we ask patients, what's your pain level? Is it a 1 or is it a 10? Similarly, you can do this with fear. So let's laser focus on it and demystify it. I think we experience fear in two ways, as I said, internal in our mind and external in a way that we show fear through expressions and actions. And the two triggers are either anticipation or actual. So look in the upper left-hand corner, you see the word homeostatic. That's when we don't experience fear. That's when we're in a level where nothing has jumped into our mind and we're not thinking about something that induces some anxiety. Sometimes we're even more than that. We're secure, or we're content, or if we're really in a great feeling, we're transcendent. But the second our mind thinks of something, anticipates something that might go wrong, we immediately slip down into doubtful, maybe skeptical or timid, apprehensive. And then when something actually happens, we experience fear, dismay, panic, sometimes even horror or mortification. FWTD is something I call a fate worse than death. And in neurosurgery, I've seen plenty of those. Those are people with dominant hemisphere strokes who can't speak and they're condemned to a nursing home in diapers, or a patient with locked-in syndrome. There are conditions where death would be a mercy. Well, it's important to understand this concept. You know, when you hear the rustle of somebody outside your door at nighttime, you're a little bit anxious, right? But when they kick in the door and you've got a criminal, a murderer inside your house, that's real fear. That's the difference between anticipation and actual. Has anyone ever read the book, The Noticer by Andy Andrews? I suggest you read it. Paul Broca was certainly a noticer. 150 years ago, Broca noticed that the gardener of his neighbor could only speak a few words. And after the gardener's death, Broca did an autopsy and found a lesion in the left frontal lobe that supported his theory. He identified speech in the left frontal lobe. He was always noticing his surroundings for possibilities. As we moved further along, Jackson went on to describe focal motor seizures, and then Penfield and Ferrier and Horsley revolutionized anatomical localization for the brain. Now we have functional MRI scanners, not just anatomy, but the physiology of thought. We've gone from mapping brain anatomy to pinpointing where thoughts and emotions are, like fear, where they actually live in the brain. The cognitive neurosciences are exploding through functional MRI scan. And we're now able to map out the neuroanatomy of fear. We've discovered the fear network, clusters of cells that form a web of activity when we experience an unexpected event. And we're beginning to understand how it works. You see, before this, it was somewhat Pavlovian. Think about it. You have a stimulus, some type of unexpected event, and you have a response, which is fear. But fear is just an alarm bell. It's not the situation or the solution. To me, fear is the messenger. It's a signpost that reads, pay attention, something meaningful is up ahead. Now, we've cut a thick path through literature and science, which leads me to a perfect segue into consilience. Consilience. You know, I was a philosophy major at William & Mary, and I believed in the balance of the humanities and the sciences. I thought it would make me a better doctor if I could think, speak, and write clearly. Here's a great start. Consilience, a concept that was discussed by biologist Edward Wilson in his masterpiece, defines consilience as a synthesis of thought by linking facts across disciplines. It's literally a jumping together of knowledge, or a sharing and borrowing of knowledge from different fields. When we do this, we in the world benefit by employing multiple ways of thinking, and we stand on firmer ground. For example, Descartes was one of the people who married geometry and algebra together to get firmer ideas about mathematics. Darwin, if we can combine Darwin's natural selection with Mendelian genetics, we stand on firmer ground in the sciences. And the perfect example, or the best example, is Einstein, whose theory of relativity was proven with mathematics, astronomy, and physics. As I've read and reflected on my career and leveraged my knowledge base of neurosurgery, I thought, how could I marry science and humanities to outthink fear? Here's another example of consilience. There's growth when minds and ideas in different disciplines come together. This image is a picture of Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, President Harding, and Sam Firestone. They used to go on trips together in the summer, and they would go camping, and they would just trade ideas, talk about things in different industries. In fact, Ford came up with the idea of the assembly line when he visited a meat packing plant and saw that the meat was being moved rather than the workers. That's when he decided to do that with his Model T assembly line. This is a great example of consilience. So I thought, in order to figure out and how to understand cognitive dominance and its relationship to fear and grief, I needed to think more broadly about how life works. So I took a page from Jordan Peterson's book, Maps of Meaning. And Jordan Peterson is quoted as saying, "We live within a framework that defines the present as eternally lacking and the future as eternally better." In other words, we're always aiming for something. This is sort of the thought structure of the world. We're all on a path from what is, where we are presently, to where we think we should be along the way. For me, in college, it was trying to perform actions to become a good physician. And along the way, I had these events that had to enter into my life, medical school and neurosurgery residency, that had to help make me. But along the way, there were things that got in the way. There were unexpected events. So as we're performing actions in an effort to get to where we should be, we experience these unexpected events. And they can either move us closer to our goal, and if they do, that gives us hope, and we're aiming closer to our expected outcome. And if they don't, they induce fear. If they block us or they keep us from going to where we should be, we have an unexpected outcome, we experience fear, and sometimes we miss the mark. Missing the mark. The definition of sin is miss the mark. And sometimes we can miss the mark because these events can throw us for a loop. Well, Carl Jung thought a lot about this. He was a Swiss psychologist, and he studied the alchemaic literature. See, we all think of the alchemists as crazy scientists that wanted to turn lead into gold, but really, he thought they were onto something, not physically, but metaphysically. See, the alchemists believed that they could transform a substance. They could apply some type of transformative event to change lead into gold or chaos into order. And Jung believed that there was the core nature of these unexpected events that represented critical moments of life change. He called them transformational moments. And he reasoned that the alchemists had homed in on the moment when something unforeseen occurs that changes the world. These events can be creative or destructive. You know, it can be a ray of sunlight that germinates a seed or melts a snowflake. There can be events like the invention of the Gutenberg press, which makes the world for the better, or worse, like the falling of the Twin Towers. Events like these revolutionize our worldview. So, how does one encounter an unexpected event, something that throws us off, that induces fear and anxiety? How do we encounter that? Whatever you want to call that uncomfortable emotion that your brain is signaling to you, and you titrate that level to the optimal level and mixture for peak performance. Like I said, you want to have a little bit of it. It's an important ingredient for performance, but too little, underperform, too much, you're frozen. I believe it's by toggling between the sciences and the humanities. We've got to break these unexpected events, these transformational moments, into parts to dissect them. And I say dissect them into 3 categories. First, define the objective and subjective. What are the objective universal descriptives of what this event is like? For instance, this is a glass of water. We can know its size, its temperature, the container that it's in, whether it's potable or not. All those things are very important, and they could be transmitted all over the world, and other people would agree. But the subjective meaning of that water has a huge difference for someone who perhaps doesn't live in an area where running water, potable water is available. This glass of water could have huge meaning for that person, as opposed to you or I, who probably had a sip of water just a few minutes ago. We also need to break these events into tools and obstacles. Is this something that's going to help us on our way, or is this obstructing us in our way? And also, is this obstruction perhaps something that could help us, that could actually be a force of good? Take J.K. Rowling. When she began to write Harry Potter, she was on welfare with a baby. And instead of feeling overwhelmed, she decided to adopt the mindset that this period would give her time to write a book that was in her head. And she began it on napkins in a coffee shop. Lastly, what is this event in terms of my repertoire of what I know and what I don't know? Have I experienced something like this before, or is it new? Now let's go back. Here's how consilience comes into play. We talked about Descartes before. Let's go back to Descartes. Remember, Descartes described a Cartesian coordinate system, the old XY algebraic system that we all learned in high school, right? Let's, on the x-axis, place the objective components of an event, and on the y-axis, let's place the subjective components of the event. And let's see if we could map out the fear of emotion. What if we could define that coordinate system and map it out? Now remember, Descartes talked about a 4-quadrant Cartesian coordinate system where x is positive and negative and y's are positive and negative. And that will give us the 4-quadrant system to work with. What if we took that gradient of fear and we actually mapped it out on a Cartesian coordinate system? It might look something like this. Remember, the 0, 0, the center of the coordinate system is homeostatic. We're neither good nor bad. We're neither in trouble or we're not in trouble. We're just normal. We're stable. If an event occurs and it's objectively positive and subjectively positive, we move into this upper right-hand quadrant where we're secure, confident, assured, certain. What happens if we have an objectively negative and a subjectively negative event? Well, that's when we actually have an active fear, terror, panic, horror, mortification situation. And then there could be gray zones in between. There can be times when we have a positive objective and a negative subjective, and a negative objective and a positive subjective. So by mapping this out, we can begin to get a feeling for where we are in this quadrant system. So here's another way of looking at it. We know the objective facts of our events, and we know the subjective truth of our events. We also know whether this is known to us or unknown to us. Clearly, if it's known to us, it's going to be more positive, and we're going to be able to deal with it a little bit better than if it's unknown. So when I talk about this, when we experience these events, and as I said before, something's objectively positive and subjectively positive, we experience flow. That's when I was taking care of Jesus Rodriguez. That's when everything was going right and everything worked. And I felt like my purpose on earth was being fulfilled. That was flow. But what if sometimes something happens where maybe you get a positive objective event, but it's subjectively negative. Let's say you get a job promotion and a corner office and a better salary, but then you realize the person you're working for right now is impossible and they're morally reprehensible. That's not a job that you're going to be able to live with for long, right? That's the calm before the storm. That's when you're living in some cognitive dissonance where your actions and your attitudes are not consistent with what's going on. What about when things are objectively negative and subjectively negative? That's the cancer scare. That's when a loved one is suffering. That's when we feel like we can't dig ourselves out of a hole. And then sometimes there are events that are objectively negative. Maybe we lose our job, but it happens to be the best thing that could have ever happened to our life. And we all say later on, wow, that was great. That gave me a chance to learn a new skill set. And I went on and I moved back into flow. And it's this constant movement from these quadrants in generally a clockwise fashion that's the heroic journey of life that we're all on. And if you can map out where you are in an unexpected event, you're going to feel better about it. You're going to know what to do next because you're going to know where your subjective truths are. Again, if you're below the y-axis, you're living in cognitive dissonance. Your meaning is being obstructed. If you're working above the y-axis on the positive, you're working in cognitive consonance. So those are examples of consilience and how we can map fear on a Cartesian coordinate system. Let's move into the third part of what one needs to grow into, and that is maximizing your platform. So that brings me back to my book. When I began writing my book, I got a proposal together and I shopped it around to agents, and they all asked me, what was my platform? And I had never really heard of the use of this word in the literary field, and I got to know it. And interestingly, around the same time, I had a personal trainer who brought these platforms and risers in for me to start working out on. He wanted me to do step-ups on it to exercise and improve my lower body strength. So I began working on it, carrying the weights, stepping up, stepping down, and I started thinking about what platforms meant, what a platform is, and how could I grow it? You see, platforms can be used for many things in life. They can be used to influence people. We jump off a platform to get on a train. Your computer works off of an operating platform. We launch rockets from platforms. A platform is something that enables human achievement. And that's the concept of a platform. I stand on these platforms every day. They give me a better view of the anatomy. They let me see more. They let me do my job better. And they also help me because I'm not the tallest surgeon in the operating room. Well, you may know this. I coach a wrestling team down in Trenton and in Princeton, and I love it because it's literally a laboratory for fear. It teaches these kids, both boys and girls, how to embrace stress. And we need to have tools to deal with it, and we can teach them tools in a safe environment. And properly armed, we can harness the stress and grow stronger from it. Well, all of these kids, interestingly, are working for a platform as well. They're working for this platform. They want to get to the top. That's what they're aiming for. And as I was talking to them about platforms, I thought it would be a powerful lesson to them to talk to them about the fact that you don't climb a platform, you build it layer by layer by layer. And all the people that are successful and using their platforms have built it over time. They built it layer by layer. So this is a wrestling platform, and I brought these risers in to the practice room, and I laid them on top of each other, and I said, these are the things you got to do. You want to be a great wrestler and you want to stand on the top of that platform, you got to do the work, right? You got to put the right food in your body. You got to be focused. You got to have the right conditioning. You have to drill your moves. You have to do your exercises, and many, many more things too. You need to be coachable and all the other things. But in a larger sense, there's a platform for life. And what I talked about with these kids was, how do you build your platform for life? You need to work on these other virtues all the time. And everybody's platform is personal and different. So you may choose to focus on some things that other people don't. That's okay. That's perfectly fine. But you need to continue to work on these risers. You see, a platform is a metaphor for life. And metaphors help our brain understand the world. In fact, metaphors are another example of consilience. This is Olivia. She's on our team. She's a fantastic wrestler. I don't know if you know this, but girls wrestling has become hugely popular in the United States, and it's an Olympic sport now. So Olivia stacked up. These were her risers that she wanted to focus on, and she's it's wonderful to be coaching girls wrestling. It's a great sport for them. I can't think of a better sport to teach self-confidence and discipline, and it's just really it's exciting time for wrestling. And also, let's remember that 90% of females in leadership roles are former athletes, yet only 9% of our CEOs are female. There is work that we need to do. These are the 3 risers that I work on the most. I'm always working on these risers. Now, I talked about lifelong learning. The first person that taught me about lifelong learning was my father, who at the age of 78 reinvented himself from attorney to military historian, and ultimately wrote his first military book at the age of 83 and completed his second at 88. And he focused on reading. Reading was his #1 exercise to get stronger and to grow. And I would submit to you also that reading builds up something called cognitive reserve. Cognitive reserve is basically like, think of it as a muscle mass for your brain. And the more you take into your old age, the better you're going to function, the less likely you're going to have dementia or Alzheimer's disease, and the more rich and vivid your life is going to be. There are numerous studies about reading and how it activates the brain. There are studies that show that cortical mantle thickening occurs with reading. There are studies that show that empathy increases with reading. There are studies that show you are able to function better on a team after reading. So it's an amazingly important part of building your platform. And I think of every single book that I read as a riser for my platform to stand higher and higher and to see more. The other riser that I focus on is faith. Now, this is a young man by the name of Kyle Snyder, the youngest American to ever win an Olympic gold medal for the United States. And I had an opportunity to spend some time with him when he came down and gave a free clinic to our Trenton wrestlers. And it was amazing to see how much faith affected him. He was literally powered by it. And if you want to achieve greatness, I found that you have to believe that you're part of something bigger. You can't be great without partnership. You know, it's funny, I give this talk sometimes as a grand rounds, and I see people in the physicians sometimes and nurses get uncomfortable when I'm talking about faith. They look away. They go to their phone. What I submit to you is that faith does not need to be spiritual. In fact, the purest definition of faith is being on the right path, directed on the right path. So I say to you, being part of a surgical or medical team, being part of an organization or an administrative team is a way of practicing faith. And we also know a lot of science about faith. Faith gives us longevity. Faith helps us. We have a decreased incidence of hypertension. We have a decreased incidence of depression, fewer hospitalizations, less cardiovascular disease, less substance abuse. It is literally healthy to have some kind of faith in your life. So I would encourage you to work on that. Here are some of the teams that I'm on. I happen to have a wonderful team of doctors that I participate with, Princeton Brain and Spine, and I know every one of these people has my back. These are my uncles, and this is my grandfather and my great uncle, who were all physicians. Here's our 4th generation physician, Connor, who's got a residency in internal medicine at Jefferson right now. And it's thrilling to be part of these teams, and I'm so fortunate to have those teams. I love this picture over here. This is Anne, who I met at my father's World War II book club. She was delivered by my grandfather in 1930 in Millburn, New Jersey on June 9th. And I get to say hello to her every time I go to my father's book club. The last riser I want to talk about is forgiveness. And there is abundant science about the act of forgiveness. It shows a functional MRI scan that there's a healing, an improvement and streamlining of other neural networks with the act of forgiveness. There's less chatter in your mind. It's helpful to exercise your muscle of forgiveness, which brings me back to that boy Anthony in Springfield. As I said, I brought him to the ICU. He awakened perfectly. But in 24 hours, that young man began to have some of the worst complications I'd ever seen. First, he started shrieking. He wouldn't let anybody touch him. Every time we touched him, he would jump and shriek as loud as he could. He developed something called cerebellar mutism, a rare postoperative complication from a pediatric brain tumor resection. It's characterized by mutism, so no talking or just shrieking, and basically no movement. So he would just sit in bed and shriek. He really suffered from that. Then he began having a fluid buildup on his brain, and I had to put a shunt in him a couple days later. Then the shunt clogged, and I had to revise the shunt. Then his pathology came back, anaplastic ependymoma, not good, aggressive. Then his wound became infected. And I just kept seeing this young boy who I thought I could save slip through my fingers with every single complication and every single insult to his nervous system, which caused him to lose more and more and more function. And that little boy, he suffered. And his parents suffered too. He spent 3 months in the hospital. And at the end of 3 months, he stabilized and was getting ready to go away for rehab and chemotherapy. And his mom and dad, who had been through so much, they were such beautiful people. They said, "Dr. McLaughlin, we want to take a picture of you with Anthony." So I dutifully stood by his bedside, and I held his hand and I posed for this picture. But I got to tell you something. I faked this smile. I faked it because there was nothing good coming to this kid. He had a bad tumor. He was never, ever going to be the same. Well, he left the hospital, but he didn't leave me. In fact, I had a healthy young 8-year-old boy in my house at the time. And that was when I began taking these long walks. I never expected to feel like this. This was not something I expected to feel as a neurosurgeon. I felt that exhilaration with Jesus, and I felt that exhilaration when I finished the surgery with Anthony. And now I felt like I wanted to crawl under a rock. I felt like I had maimed this boy. What could I have done differently? Could I have retracted on his cerebellum less? Could I have picked up his complications sooner? Could I have done something to prevent him from needing a shunt? Over and over and over again, I'd run these questions in my mind. Have an extra scotch, go for a long walk, chew tobacco, a number of bad coping skills that we all have sometimes when we don't know what to do. Well, I ultimately decided I couldn't deal with this fear and grief and anxiety anymore. I wasn't going to do pediatric neurosurgery anymore. And I moved. I couldn't bear to have another Anthony. So I moved down to New Jersey, made the best of my practice, and fast forward 15 years, began writing a book about fear and grief. And as I'm working on it in my office, I periodically would walk by that picture with me and Anthony. And every time I walked by that picture, I felt sad. Well, I realized that I had never really figured out what happened to Anthony after all those years. And I realized I had to if I was going to finish this book and write about fear and grief. So I got on Facebook and I started thumbing through the sites, and I came upon the LaQuarrie Pizza Parlor in Springfield, Massachusetts. And lo and behold, I saw a picture of his mom and dad. I scrolled down a little further and I saw a 24-year-old boy man now, in a wheelchair with his parents at Rockefeller Center. Oh my God, Anthony's still alive. I couldn't believe it. I called his parents and told them I was writing a book. And I told them how Anthony had profoundly affected me, and I wanted to come up and see them. They invited me up with open arms, and I drove up that weekend, came to their pizza parlor, and I got to visit with them, and I saw and visited with Anthony. And Anthony definitely has some neurological disabilities, but he's still there with his family. And I talked to his mom and dad, and I told them about how I had always wondered what I could have done differently and how I felt like I had let them down. And they came around the table. The second I said that, they gave me this big hug and they said, "Dr. McLaughlin, you're our hero. You saved our boy. He's still with us. He's my #1 helper here still." And they showered me with presents. They gave me a purse for my wife that they had gotten in Italy, and they gave me a shoot from the plant that they had started their restaurant with 30 years before. And they gave me another picture, this picture that I had totally forgotten about. It was a picture they took the day before we left Springfield to go to New Jersey with my family and their family. And this was hanging on their wall. And I thought, wow, I had my picture on my wall and I was feeling sad, and they had this picture on their wall and they were feeling happy. And when I got into my car and drove home, I thought, wow, you had this whole thing wrong. You had told yourself a story that was just a story. And I called my co-writer right away, Sean, and I said, "Sean, I got to tell you, you wouldn't believe this, that Anthony's still alive, and Anthony is with his family, and I can't believe it. And I'm so grateful, and I can't believe that I thought the way I did." And Sean said, "That's great. You know, Mark, we should put the story of Jesus and the story of Anthony together." And I said, "Well, what do you mean? That doesn't make any sense. It's, you know, one's a story about maybe forgiveness and the other stories about success." And he said, "Mark, you don't get it, do you? You still don't get it." I said, "What?" He said, "Mark, you take somebody who's paralyzed and you help him walk again and you say it's luck. And you take a young boy who's got a bad tumor and you do everything you can for him and he has a bad outcome and you say it's your fault. That's an impossible standard to live up to." So I ask you, the listener, participants out there, who are your Anthony's? Who or what are you holding to yourself to that's an impossible standard? We all do this to ourselves. We tell ourselves a story, and it's just one piece of a larger picture. I can tell you one thing. When I walk by this picture in my office now, that smile is real. It's real. And I can tell you, to wrap up the concepts of cognitive dominance, that I went through all 4 of these periods with Anthony. First flow with the surgery. Then I was in that calm before the storm where I felt bad, but I didn't know why I felt bad. I didn't think it was part of what I was supposed to feel as a doctor. And then I just tumbled into this all is lost, where I had poor coping strategies and I never thought I could do pediatric neurosurgery. And it took me 15 years to move up into the birthing a new skill set, where I would actually say, wait a minute, it was a privilege to take care of Anthony. I wouldn't trade that for anything. And wow, I did release my gift on that day of surgery. And he is still here on earth. And he's still mom and dad's #1 guy. And I moved back into flow, where I knew what my purpose was in neurosurgery and how I would never, ever make that mistake again. So my path towards cognitive dominance, and I submit to you that I'm still a student. I'm still learning about this. But in order to get it, I believe that you need to pursue lifelong learning believe in consilience, the jumping together of knowledge and disciplines, and focus and continue to build on your platform to always get to your next level and your next level and your next level. I'd like to entertain some questions at this time, if anybody has any. David, I'll turn the con over to you.
Thanks so much, Doctor. And as we transition to the Q&A segment of today's webinar, I see that some of you have already submitted questions. Thank you very much for those. If you haven't, and if you have a question, you can type them at any time into the Q&A box that you'll find on your screen. So let's get started, Doctor, with this first question. This one's from Faith. Faith wants to know, in your book, you talk about brain 1.0 and brain 2.0 and their interaction. Can you elaborate on that and what it has to do with cognitive dominance?
Sure. So think of cognitive dominance as like training your brain to think ambidextrously, okay? Think about it toggling between your right brain and your left brain. Remember, your left brain is typically the logical, fact-based part of your brain. That's the hemisphere. And the right brain is the more story-based, the more meaning. That's the perceptual thing. That's where it interprets like a face or an angry face or a happy face. So think about toggling between your right brain and your left brain. Think about switching between your primitive brain survival instincts, that's brain 1.0, that's your survival, and executive function, your higher level brain 2.0, your more developed brain. Think about toggling between the subjective and the objective. In essence, it's balancing between the sciences and humanities to leverage your brain power for its best performance.
Okay, and thank you, Faith, for that question. We're going to move on to this next question now from Trey. Doctor, we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar that today's event is being made possible by Peak Performance Physicians and also your firm, Princeton Brain, Spine, and Sports Medicine. Trey wants to know, how are you actually connected with Peak Performance Physicians?
Well, that's a great question. Peak Performance Physicians and I go way back. In fact, I first met Peak Performance Physicians when I was in an all is lost quadrant. I had just left my second practice and I started to ask myself, maybe this is you, maybe you are the problem. And I reached out to John McDaniel and his team. And they, I had to kind of figure out and dig deep, what can I do? How can I turn something bad into something good? And that was to create something. And so I wanted to create my own practice, but I needed the help from somebody who knew the entire business of medicine. So I reached out to John, and John literally helped interview my first few staff members. He helped me set up an account. He negotiated with a hospital one of my contracts. He guided me through managed care and created a employee training system for us. He also managed our revenue cycles, and he really taught me the business of medicine. And I went from literally crawling, to walking to running. And I can say without a doubt, Princeton Brain and Spine has now been, Princeton Brain, Spine, and Sports Medicine is now a multi-physician, multi-specialty practice with 9 physicians and 60 employees. I could never have done it without Peak Performance Physicians and John McDaniel and his team.
All right, let's go next to this question from Mark. This one just came in a moment ago. How can you control or stop the left brain criticism so that the right brain can flow?
Well, I don't think you can ever completely stop the criticism. I think that it's something that you need to train over time to do. You need to adopt a new attitude. This has happened to me as well, and I'm constantly working on this. When I'm a coach and I'm coaching kids how to wrestle, I'm so forgiving when they're making mistakes. I'm so patient with them. And then I find that I'm not that patient with myself. So I'm trying to adopt a more encouraging, nurturing coach of my own. I think that would be one step. Try to focus in a daily routine to add some positive comments in the same voice that you hear that chatter. Add some positive comments to it. That's one. And secondly, I think that your right brain interprets stories. Your left brain is more logical. So when you're criticizing yourself, I think it's good to balance and have your right brain think of, hey, you've got 5 criticisms, but how many of these are factually actually correct? Probably none. Look at my questioning myself about Anthony. There was nothing I could have done differently for Anthony. His surgery was well within the time period that we use it. The postoperative scan looked good. His infection was picked up quickly and appropriately. These are complications that happen. So similarly, I had this negative chatter like you could have done something better for him. And then finally, after a long period of time, I was able to say, no, you're not, that's invalid. That's not correct. And I'm not going to listen to you anymore. It's hard, but I think step by step, you can retrain what your brain says to you.
Still have a few minutes left for Q&A, so if you have a question for Dr. McLaughlin, get it in, type it into the Q&A box. Let's go now to a question from Stephen. How can healthcare administrators benefit from your book, Doctor?
Well, I think it's a glimpse into the mind of someone who sees the world from the medical world from a philosophical viewpoint. So they're going to get a glimpse of how a doctor thinks. They're going to get a taste of what it's like to have unexpected events occur during surgeries and before surgeries that maybe really don't need to happen, because I do get into some of the nuances of managed care and some of the detriments it has to patient care. So I think they would get a glimpse into that. And then I think it would be a team building, a good team building exercise to share some of the experiences, because all healthcare workers, every nurse I know and every doctor out there carries an Anthony with them. And it doesn't take much to extrapolate that we all have an experience that we play back in our mind over and over again and think we could have done it better, and maybe we just were doing the best we possibly could at that time, and we gotta forgive ourselves and let it go. So I think it's really a glimpse into the medicine from the mind of a doctor, a philosophical view, and lastly, a team building exercise to share and get people to talk about their experiences and how they may also be holding themselves to an impossible standard.
I think we can squeeze in one final question, Doctor. This one's from Bridget. Earlier, we saw the cover of your book, and Bridget would like to know, what is the significance of that red hand gripper on the cover of your book?
That is my father's old hand gripper that he used to carry in his car with him everywhere. And whenever we stopped at a red light, whenever we were waiting for somebody at the airport, whenever we were on a long highway drive, he was squeezing that over and over and over again. And he just used to always say, this is great for wrestling. It'll give you great grip strength. But the lessons, that $5 trinket he gave to me were incredible. You can exercise anywhere, even in your car. Never waste a second of your life. Exercise can give you both physical energy and cognitive energy. I was a lucky young man to have a father who encouraged exercise, even when exercising wasn't cool, it wasn't modern. He picked it up when it was, in the 40s, when people thought it was dangerous or ridiculous. So he was ahead of his time, and I thought, as a tribute to him, we'd put the gripper on the cover, because it's all about getting a grip on your life by outthinking fear.
All right. Well, we are just about out of time. Thank you so much to everyone who submitted a question. Before we wrap things up, Doctor, I'm going to hand it back to you for some closing remarks.
David, thank you so much for organizing this. You're a true professional. This was excellent. John and Chance, it's a pleasure to be a part of your team, and I thank you for all of your service and helping me along the way, and for the sponsorship of this talk. And all of the participants, thank you for listening. I welcome your feedback. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are about this. Please comment either on Amazon if you have a comment for the book, or if you want to reach me, you have my email and my Instagram accounts that you can send me a message. I'd love to hear from you. I'm constantly, as I said, I'm a student, not an expert in this. I feel like I'm a student, and I want to share my knowledge with people so that they can become students and learn more as well. Thank you so much.
And a big thanks to you, Doctor, for all of your insights